make sure that you're really, really sure about what you're sending. Be very confident in your pitch before you reach out, because you don't have a lot of time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Media Coffee, a podcast by Cision and PR Newswire. I'm your host, Sami Saad, and today I'm joined by Sara Kopamees, the editor-in-chief at Best Practice Canada. Sara has over 20 years of experience as a writer and editor covering Canadian business and CSR stories. In this episode, we'll discuss Sara's career path in journalism and publishing, her editorial process, and what PR pros should know about landing press coverage in Canadian business media. So, Sara, thank you so much for joining us, and how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me, Sammy. I really appreciate it. It's great to meet you.
Awesome, great to have you on, and great to meet you as well. Let's start with how your career led to Best Practice Canada. Could you share a little bit about your path into journalism and how it ultimately led to your current role?
Absolutely. So I've been a writer my entire life, and as many journalists and people in my line of work are, anything you can name, I've dabbled in. The journalism path was not a straight one for me. I went to university for an arts degree and wasn't sure if I wanted to pursue journalism or if I wanted to focus on social causes. But ultimately, I graduated and went into communications, and I had a very, very exciting career in communications until about my mid-20s. At which point I did start to work in publishing, and I helped grow a company from 1 to 5 titles in a couple of years. I worked with some trade magazines. I've been in business journalism a long time. But ultimately, the journalism focus has been my passion since I was a teenager, and I started. My first journalism job was actually at a little daily in a town called Aurora in Ontario, Canada, and just a really winding path, but here we are, and best practice today is something I'm very proud of. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that with you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And you got to start somewhere. So it led you to your current role as an editor-in-chief, which is very impressive. Can you talk a little bit about your current role and what Best Practice Canada is doing and publishing?
Absolutely. So I worked for a long time with various general business magazines. So within Canada, but also internationally. And I think that probably what most of your viewership has seen is that business has shifted quite a bit, in the sense that people are savvy, especially Canadians. They want to see that companies are responsible, that they're operating in a socially sustainable way. My focus has traditionally, in the last 15 years or so, been on corporate social responsibility. I tend to look at the angles of culture, accessibility, how are we being inclusive in the workplace? How are we being inclusive when we're talking to stakeholders? These are things that, once upon a time, I'd say, 15, 20 years ago, they were really great things to have on paper, but in the real world and how things actually affect people that are affected by business, that's a different story. We're talking about a total overhaul of a value system for a corporation or a company. And that's where my career path has really focused on. So, talking to companies and entrepreneurs about what they're doing and how that's affecting the actual people that they're serving. So not just consumers, but we're talking about local communities. We're talking about other types of stakeholders, people in communities and groups that might be affected by what you're doing. So best practice is really focused on that. We're sort of narrowing down on those issues and those topics. So where culture and business and the bottom line, where those things intersect. So yeah, it's a really interesting space. And I've done some incredible interviews with wonderful people who are more well-versed on the subject than I am, but it's really been about this shift in the marketplace and how something that looks really great on paper, what that translates to in real life.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, I'm going to ask you about the people that you interviewed, or like what your favorite interview is, a little bit later. But
Sure.
want to make sure I cover this. cover local businesses in Canada or Canadian businesses primarily, or do you also cover businesses that are internationally based, but they operate in Canada?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I appreciate pitches from PR companies and individuals from all sorts of businesses, and whether that's in Canada or internationally. What I focus on typically is I do want to know what the Canadian angle is. If you are an international corporation, but you have offices here, I want to know how you're affecting Canadian communities. And typically, Canada is such a large place, the population is dense in certain spots, but we're a very different marketplace than other countries. So, I do appreciate when I get a pitch from a company in the U.S. They're our closest neighbors, happy to listen, but also I think it's important that what's happening in our own backyard, I want to know about that. So, come at me anytime with a pitch from somewhere other than Canada. But typically, if I'm looking at digging deeper, it's something that's going to affect Canadian communities.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your editorial process? What typically draw inspirations? Where do you draw inspirations from and ideas for your next story?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the key thing here, most PR people recognize that there's a lot of noise out there. And as journalists and editors, we are always in a constant state of combat there. So we're always looking at how are we going to get through all the noise and get to the good stuff? How are we going to get the right headlines? How are we going to figure out the right angles for a story? And for me personally, the most interesting stories are people-based. It's whether a person is doing something new or potentially doing something that has an impact on someone else or another organization. And the one thing that I always say is impact and innovation. So if I'm looking at a story, it has to be impactful or it has to be innovative. It's either someone or a company doing something completely new, or somebody or something, a company doing something that's impacting someone else. So these are things that I really look for. And if I'm being completely honest, if I get something that's totally out of my wheelhouse, it gets deleted. So I think that that's something that PR people have to be aware of, is that we only have a certain amount of time in the day, and you know that already as somebody that consumes media. We have to sort of get through that mess, and we have to get through that clutter, and we have to get to the bottom of the story. So anything you could do to make that easier is always helpful, and it speaks to me personally as an editor if you can do that.
And just to follow up on what you said, like the emails that get deleted,
Yeah,
want to
there are a
know.
lot.
Yeah, I want to know, like, can you give some examples of of those and what kind of pitches that like are not in your, be not even relevant to you?
Yeah, so I think that I mean, you've heard this a million times, like you have to know your audience, right? So typically the stories that I'm doing and the coverage I'm doing is not technical. So if someone comes to me with a pitch, or I'm on a list, which I do appreciate lists, I love getting daily news from, all sorts of companies and industries. But if you put some kind of techie jargon in the headline or in the subject line of your email, I'm immediately deleting it. If I want the technical information, I will ask for it. What I want is the angle. I really want to know what's the impact and how is this innovative? Like, show me that first, and then we can dig into the nitty gritty. So the typically the ones that get deleted are like, we don't need the details up front. We want to hear why it matters. That's what we want to hear.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And so we talked about the bad pitches. What about the good ones? What if you get a pitch, for example, if you can recall a recent one, maybe you don't have to give specifics, obviously, but like what was the thing about the pitch that got your attention? Was it the subject? Was it the first line? Was it the person that's pitching you, the company? If you could talk to us about that.
Of course, yeah, for sure. I guess it's going to again vary between different types of journalists and editors.
Mhm.
Because I'm focused on business, my audience is a little bit different, and also my preferences are different, right? So I'm always trying to stay up to date on current events. That's something that is very, very important, regardless of what field you're in as a journalist. But I think that when it comes down to, what's going to be exciting for me personally or as a journalist is going to be, I think, again, the people angle, right? So if you are pitching to me and you're talking about the founder of a company who's taken that company from 2 employees to 300 in 12 months, I mean, there's the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to know how that happened. I want to know the ins and outs. I want to know what makes that person different. What sets them apart from all the other competitors in their industry. If you tell me that this franchisee has gone from one location to 80 and that's only taken 5 years, why? Tell me why. How did this person just beat out the competition? How did they what's special about their team? What's special about their product? What's special about their services? Those are the things that if you can get me in the first 5 minutes, I'm totally interested in what you have to say.
I love that. And I want to dig a little bit deeper just to unpack this further. Let's say I'm sure you receive pitches from people in the US or other countries probably. What are something that you think, some best practices if you want to reach Canadian media?
Yep.
Are there like any, cultural sensitivities or, specific language or, common mistakes that you see, and what can people do to, to better have a better chance of like landing coverage and Canadian media and engaging with Canadian reporters?
Okay, that's a great question. And I appreciate you asking, because I think that there is a big difference between pitching to a Canadian news outlet versus maybe pitching to somebody else. And I'm very Canada focused. Every country has their own stories. So, Canada's no different. We have our own. But I think that if you are pitching to a Canadian editor or journalist, look at the news, look at the Canadian news in particular, right? So be aware of what's going on in the media and the news landscape here before you pitch, because it might be that it's just not a good time. It might not be that the thing that you want to talk about is relevant. And it's really as easy as that. So just making sure that you're aware of what's going on in our country and what's happening and what's important, what things are top of mind for people, for Canadians, for consumers, for business owners. Because again, I think I'm going to go back to, you probably have 30 seconds before I delete your email. So make sure that you're really, really sure about what you're sending. Be very confident in your pitch before you reach out, because you don't have a lot of time. That said, if you get through and we end up having a conversation, and even better, we end up doing a story together, you're probably on my radar for life. So those relationships are really, really important. And I go back to its impact and innovation. So show me something that's impactful and show me something that's innovative, and then I'm hooked. I want to hear more.
I think that's a great point, and I really appreciate you sharing that. It's something that you can apply across the board to whether you're pitching Canada or any other country, is
100%.
to do your due diligence, read up on the news quickly, see what's going on. Is there a holiday maybe, or,
Yes,
just things like
absolutely.
that are very
Absolutely.
important.
Yeah, and
100%.
I think that also, to your point, when we're talking about like the worldwide media, again, those pitches, when you are reaching out to somebody, you can do very, very small things just to make them more relevant to me or my audience, right? So put the effort in, like try to assess that, like what's going to make sense for the Canadian audience versus the US audience. And right now, especially in 2025, there's obvious things that you can do, right? So be aware, be cognizant of those, I guess, nuances before you reach out, because if you can build a relationship with me, it's probably going to happen pretty quickly, and then we can work it out after that. We can figure out what we want to say.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree. Let's shift a little bit towards the broader industry, and from your perspective as an editor, you touched upon this a little bit in the beginning, but how has the Canadian media space been changing in just the most recent years, like the last 5 to 10 years?
I love that you asked me that. So I think the one thing that maybe people don't realize is that it wasn't very long ago that we didn't have social media. In the grand scheme of things, it seems like social media has been around forever, but I was alive. I was, in the workplace when social media didn't exist. Social media has absolutely, completely disrupted journalism. It has completely disrupted the concept of what it means to be a journalist, and it's disrupted all the facets of media. And I don't think that's bad. But there's a really clear shift that's happened, and it's something that everyone needs to be aware of, is that creators are not necessarily journalists, and journalists are not necessarily creators. So I think that when people are consuming their media and consuming their news, they need to be so aware of that fact. So a creator can come to you and say, XYZ stat, I pulled this information from wherever. That's not necessarily factual. And the thing is because they're creating for a specific audience, but they're not necessarily investigating what they're talking about. And that's okay. There's really a place for everything. There is a place for social media. It's an excellent driving force for a number of reasons, but it's completely changed how people think of journalism and how people think of content creation. And that's something to be aware of, I think, as the consumer, as the person that's, on the other end of it. You have to be so careful where you're getting your information. We saw it with COVID, especially for obvious reasons, but you want to be careful with your sources. And I think that that's the biggest shift, is that who are the sources and where is this information coming from? The general public doesn't necessarily think that way all the time, but I know that journalists do. We're really seeing this idea that now journalists have to be multifaceted too, right? You have to figure out how your message is going to be conveyed in your article, but then also how's it going to be conveyed into, a short little blurb on Instagram or whatever it happens to be. So this is a huge, huge shift. And it's just in the last, I'm going to say 5 years or so, that people have sort of taken on the role of a journalist, but you're a creator, but you're not necessarily a journalist. Those two things don't always go hand in hand.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because it is, 100% what's going on right now in the industry. And the same thing applies to PR professionals as well. They, you need social media, as one of your tools. And, for many reasons, for monitoring what's going on, to reaching out to journalists, sometimes that helps. Let's talk about now your favorite story. So your favorite interview or any project that you've done that, you'd like to share, any lessons that you learned from it that you'd like to share with the audience as well.
Okay, great. So I'll be honest with you, I had a hard time with this question. I've done thousands of interviews. I've talked to so many incredible people, politicians, community leaders. The list goes on, and I'm absolutely grateful for every single one of those experiences, because they've led me to other great experiences and conversations. But I'm going to say that the most influential or impactful one that happened, and this often happens when you are an editor or a journalist, was one of my first. So I had a sit-down conversation back in the mid-2000s with Arlene Dickinson, Kevin O'Leary, and Robert Herjavec, who at the time were part of the cast of Dragon's Den. I've since interviewed them separately. Wonderful people. I've interviewed other dragons, so fun. But this particular interview was a lunchtime interview. So we sat down at a restaurant in Toronto, and I was so green at the time. But it was it's kind of tied for my top 5 favorite interviews. But this particular interview was so impactful because I asked a lot of questions about business. I asked a lot of questions about, how did you grow your companies? How did you figure out who your stakeholders were? What are those processes like? And it's funny because the conversations quickly evolved. They quickly evolved to, how did you grow up? How did your family influence what you were doing? What kind of impact do you think you had on your children when you were trying to achieve all these things? And I was just, a young journalist in my 20s. I didn't really know what I was doing. And by the end of that conversation, at one point or another, we'd all been in tears, because you start to realize when you have these deep conversations with people that everybody's a human being. So it doesn't matter how quickly your company's grown, or, you know, what types of impact you've had, or how many companies you've created. All of these people are just people, and everybody has a story, and everyone wants to be heard. So after that interview, I remember thinking, like, I want to make sure that I understand who the person is that I'm talking to, and not just what the selling feature is about their product, or what it is that they can offer the world, or offer Canada. So I think that those early conversations, those early interviews really shaped the type of interviewer I am today. But also, I think just really shaped how I saw the world, and how I saw people that on the surface look very successful and look like they have it all together. I think that human connection is number one for me. So that's really influenced everything else I've done since.
Yeah, and that's what makes a great story, the human connection. So, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I absolutely love it. So finally, where can people reach you, connect with you, and read the
Absolutely.
stories that you just mentioned?
So I'm a little bit of a weirdo. You can text me anytime. Like anybody in the world, you can text me anytime. Happy to give you my number. If you go to bestpracticecanada.com, those are the 2 most recent editions. The archives will be uploaded as they come. But I would love to hear people's stories. One of the main things is I really value learning opportunities. So I want to learn together. I want to hear about sustainability stories. I want to hear about accessibility in the workforce, all of those things. So yeah, absolutely reach out and pitch me a story. If you do email me, just make your pitch good. I get so many emails all the time. So,
Watch this interview first and then email.
Yeah, exactly. Just please, like, make sure you know who you're talking to, and make sure, like, you got to get me. And if you get me, I'm yours for life. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining and sharing your thoughts, and giving us a look into your journey and perspective on Canadian media. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode of Media Coffee, please rate it, share it with your network, and it will help us reach more communicators like you, and journalists and publishers as well. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Media Coffee.
Thanks so much, Sammy.